Thank you so much. I hope you hear me. Um, I'm Judith Herrin, still somewhat loosely attached to King's College London, and today it is my great pleasure to introduce Mary Cunnigham, and she will talk about her new book, The Lives of the Virgin and St. Andrew by Epiphanios the monk. But I want to say how delighted I am to have this opportunity to salute Mary's incredible skills, because over the years, she has made available in very accessible, extremely useful translations and commentaries, a great mass of material that was neglected by Byzantinists, even literary specialists, because some of these hagiographies and homilies, particularly the sermons and hymns, were really not very much studied in the late 20th century as a rich source of new material. And I became aware of Mary's skills with her wonderful publication in 1992 of the life of Michael the Synkellos. I think everybody knew this was a very important text and nobody read it. Or perhaps they knew that it was possibly written by someone from Jerusalem who came to Constantinople and thereby contributed to enriching the culture of the capital city. But there are very, very few references to Michael the Synkellos, who turns out to have been an extremely influential and important figure. And what I admire so much is not only that Mary translates so beautifully, but that she has the capacity to place these texts in their context so that you can understand them as literary works and for the importance that they bring to an understanding of the period in which they were written. And her commentaries are a source of enormous wealth of material, which should be taken into account. I think the stress that she's put on the importance of sermons, for example, and the importance of preaching, the notion of the audience for whom bishops preached. And these relationships are so important and give us a real insight into how Byzantine society works. But I mustn't go on too long because the importance of this festival is to present new works. And so I invite Mary to talk about her new book.
Right. Thank you so much, Judith, for this wonderful introduction. I hope people can see me and hear me at this point.
Yes.
Good. So there's not really time to thank all the people involved in organizing this wonderful festival, conference, whatever you want to call it. But I do, and it's a great honor to be here. Now I'm going to attempt to share my screen, but wait a minute. This may take a moment. I'm sorry, I think I'm going to skip this because it doesn't seem to be working, but it doesn't matter. So the book that I'm talking about today belongs to the Translated Texts for Byzantinists series at the University of Liverpool University Press, and it was conceived and mostly completed during the period of the COVID pandemic. I needed a project that I could work on at home during the year or two when it was impossible to visit nearby libraries. It also involved a couple of texts which I had encountered during my work on the cult of the Virgin Mary in Byzantium, the results of which had been published a year or two earlier. As I worked on a translation and commentary for this life, I decided also to work on what is thought to be Epiphanios' only other literary production, namely the Life and Acts of St. Andrew, the first called apostle. The latter text describes Andrew's travels and mission in Asia Minor and along the coast of the Black Sea through Iberia, present-day Georgia, and up to the Crimea. before turning to his miracles and martyrdom in Petros on the northwestern coast of the Peloponnese Peninsula. The life and acts of Andrew reveals much more than does the life of the Virgin, the iconophile leanings of Epiphanios, as well as his direct encounters with iconoclast policies during the second period in which they were enacted, that is, between 815 and 843 CE. Both texts are thus important witnesses to the time of religious and cultural change, in which Byzantine ideas about sacred objects, space, and identity were being challenged and redefined. When writing his Life of the Virgin, Epiphanius the monk, who probably belonged to the monastery of Callistratos in Constantinople, aimed to provide, in his own words, quote, something in simple language for those who long for the facts about this holy figure, unquote. One of the interesting features of this life, as well as of the life and acts of Andrew, is the way in which he relies on both canonical and apocryphal sources, as well as on his own imagination in his construction of a legendary biography for the Virgin. He stresses above all the ascetic practices of the Virgin, beginning during her sojourn in the Jewish temple as a child, and concluding after Christ's ascension into heaven, when she was living in Jerusalem in the house of the evangelist John. This probably reflects Epiphanius' delivery of the oration to a mainly monastic audience. Our 9th century hagiographer also describes the physical appearances of both Mary and Jesus Christ, along with material signs of their terrestrial lives in Jerusalem. Perhaps in response to iconoclasm, he wishes to emphasize the human nature of both figures, while also recognizing the unchanging and eternal divinity of Mary's Son. Turning to the life and acts of St. Andrew, this reveals many similarities in style and content with the life of the Virgin. Epiphanius announces his literary sources in a similar way in his prologue, suggesting his careful use of both canonical and apocryphal sources in order to piece together the apostles' legendary story. One of the most interesting aspects of this text lies in its juxtaposition of Epiphanius the monk's contemporary experience with the Apostle Andrew's travels in Asia Minor and along the coast of the Black Sea. Epiphanius says that he and a fellow monk named James fled the newly reinstated iconoclast rulers and followed the route that St. Andrew was believed to have taken from the port Sinope eastwards towards Trebizond. They also traveled to Nicaea, Chalcedon, and other Bithynian cities in search of oral memories and material signs, not only of Andrew, but also of other apostolic and early Christian saints. I might add as an aside here that the late Byzantine scholar Cyril Mango took this account seriously enough to follow it too, seeking out objects and places described by Epiphanius in his account. But above all, the early 9th century hagiographer depicts Andrew as an eloquent preacher and worker of miracles. The life and acts may, as Francis Dvornik argued, reflect growing Byzantine interest in Andrew's role as the apostle who was responsible for founding a Christian bishopric in Constantinople. However, the text also, like the Life of the Virgin, reflects the author's monastic and iconophile background. Epiphanius firmly believes that the early apostles, like the Theotokos, provide the best models for the virginal or at least celibate monks and nuns throughout Christendom. I should also mention briefly, and I hope I have time, that both texts belong to complicated manuscript traditions, as I discovered when I began comparing Albert Dressel's edition to the surviving witnesses. In the first edition of my book, which was published in 2023, I solved this problem by offering major variant readings in appendices for both texts. Shortly after producing that book, however, I was informed of the critical edition of the Life and Acts of Andrew by Andrei Vinogradov, published in St. Petersburg in 2005. This is probably the most embarrassing error in my scholarly life. Vinogradov argues in his introduction to this text that the two versions which appear in the surviving manuscripts were both written by Epiphanios the monk, with the second being a revision that he worked on a decade or two after the first. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the editors of TTB and Liverpool University Press for allowing me to publish a revised edition of the book just a few months after it first appeared. So that one came out in 2024. In conclusion, Epiphanios the monk offers a unique vision of two exceptionally holy people in this pair of hagiographical texts. He constructs compelling narratives, although these are not without some crude changes of subject, grammatical errors, and inconsistencies, by combining canonical and apocryphal sources with oral memories that he picked up on his travels around Asia Minor. His experience of the cultural and religious changes that were taking place in early 9th century Byzantium at the beginning of the second period of iconoclasm is important from an historical point of view. But above all, this is a monastic vision, which idealizes the spiritual lives of two of Christ's earliest followers. They both helped to attract converts to what Epiphanius saw as a radical new way of life and set of beliefs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. That was very helpful. I was going to just flash up the book because you haven't shown the very nice cover and the presentation as it is in the Liverpool series. And we are so thrilled to have this volume in the series. It's volume 13. As you heard yesterday, this is the series that is expanding. And if anyone listening is interested in making a translation of a Byzantine text or a text relative to Byzantium and to Byzantine studies, we are very anxious to include that or to consider it for the series. I don't see any questions that have yet come into the Q&A. Callum, do you have anything that I can't see over here? No, but I have a.
Oh, I don't, sorry.
I have a very simple question, because one of the surprising things about these texts, reading your translation, I can see, looking over at the Greek, some of the terms are very erudite and unusual, and yet it is clearly designed to appeal to people who will understand it as it is delivered orally. So it's not dependent on technical elaboration, but it's intended to be easily accessed. How is it that, where do you suppose Epiphanius got his education, which gave him this capacity to combine the rather complex vocabulary with a presentation which is immediately accessible?
It's a very good question. I presume that he had the normal education which a monk might have in the 9th century. He had access to many texts, possibly in the patriarchal library or in his own monastery. Although, well, I'm digressing, I'll carry on. I believe that he wrote deliberately in a simple style. And as you say, this may reflect a certain amount of editing before these were copied into manuscripts. They survive mainly in collections of manuscripts that were intended for liturgical use. So we have a sort of trace of an oral delivery. They're normally organized into a feast day, either the 15th of August or sometimes the 8th of September, the birthday of the Virgin Mary. That's with regard to Mary, of course. For Andrew, they would be on the 30th of November, and read out possibly in the service, the liturgical service, or in orthros, or even in a refectory. That's the afterlife of those texts. But I think his combination of very colloquial language, it really is quite low style, is deliberate, not necessarily reflecting a very elementary education. I think he probably studied rhetoric and, the necessary tools for writing these texts. However, they are the only ones that we know that are attributed to him,
Yeah,
which is odd in itself in a way. I'd just add that the Life and Acts of Andrew is much more disorganized than the Life of the Virgin. He keeps switching between his own trip and that of Andrew, which can be confusing at times,
yes.
as if it's sort of train of thought or notes perhaps from a diary that he took on his journey.
Yes, very, very likely. Clearly, this interesting aspect that he was looking for traces of the saint and his on St. Andrew's travels with oral memories that have been passed over many centuries among people who said, yes, he was here, and
Yeah,
wanted to draw attention to their ownership of a part of St. Andrew's travels. And then
right.
the martyrdom in Patras, which is very dramatic, and
Yes,
this extraordinary episode with the.
yes,
Anyway, I mean, it does make a very good story, and clearly that's also very nice for listeners who are having to go to church because it's the St. Andrew feast day, and they are. This is something that will really excite them and interest them, keep their interest. Um, if I could go back a little bit further, just for a few last question, would it be correct to think that Epiphanios probably belonged to the generation of Tarasios, those distinguished secular officials who'd been very well educated in iconoclast Constantinople because the schools had continued? I
yes.
wonder at what stage he became a monk, and whether he brought with him that style of secular learning as well.
Hmm. I think that's highly possible. One of the hypotheses that Andrei Vinogradov presents is that he was possibly connected with the Studites and stayed at their monastery in Bithynia for quite a while. I think Vinogradov then argues that he may have, for some reason or other, moved on. I hope I'm remembering this correctly because he fell out with them. But the first version of the Life and Acts of Andrew, Vinogradov argues, was written when he was in contact with the Studites and that they were providing him with some inside information and also with, erudite
Yeah,
things to quote, such as a bit of a letter by Theodore, and there's various other bits of evidence that he presents there. But he was
fascinating.
possibly very much in touch with highly educated monks in
Right.
various monasteries, not only in Constantinople, but also Bithynia, most likely.
Excellent. There is a question. Callum can read it out, perhaps.
Yes, there's a question from Max Ritter. Was Epiphanios also the author of the description of the Holy Land edited by Donner? Were you able to identify any intertextual references between your two works and this text?
This has been studied, and I believe most scholars are in a consensus that no, he's not the same person as that writer. The evidence, as I remember, is mainly that he displays ignorance of the Holy Land in both of his lives of Mary and of Andrew. And in that description, it's very detailed account of someone who lived or visited Jerusalem and the Holy Land and knew it very well. And I think it's thought that this was probably a Greek monk living in Palestine at the time who wrote that work. The editor Dressel, Albert Dressel, included it in his collection of works for Epiphanios, but they're not connected. Although they both lived around the same time, I think it's thought.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so we should hand on to the next book. But thank you again for presenting the Lives of the Virgin and St. Andrew the First Call.
Thank you so much, Judith.